There is an absolute bombshell of a fruit reveal being saved for Loki. Oda has been building up to Loki's release the entire arc, and even now he is teasing what Loki's true abilities are, having Loki begin by using his hammer rather than showing us his legendary fruit. And the simple fact that Oda is setting the scene with juxtaposing both the terror of Loki and the terror of Nika may be leading up to the simple answer that Loki has in fact eaten another version of the Nika fruit. And all the foreshadowing that has built up for Loki in Elbaf so far points to this. Because from everything that we've been told, there should be at least 2 versions of the Nika fruit. The Giants of Elbaf have different concepts of what Nika is supposed to be. Some imagine Nika as this laughing warrior of liberation like Luffy, but others imagine Nika as an entity of destruction. And if a large enough number of giants have different visions of what Nika is, then based on Vegapunk's explanation of how devil fruits work, 2 different versions of the same fruit will come to be. And so far, all the buildup of Elbaf and all of the hints and bits of foreshadowing surrounding Loki from his introduction that there is a destroyer version of the Nika fruit, and this is the very fruit that Loki, the other sun god, has claimed. The very thing that he told us from his introduction is about to be revealed as the truth. Luffy is not alone, because the Elbaf arc itself is set to pose a very important character conflict for Luffy. What does it actually mean to be Nika, and what is the correct path for Nika in this world? Loki, as the alternate version of Nika, may force Luffy to answer this question. But first, this month we have some of the most legendary islands in One Piece for you. You can get God Valley, Marijua, Laugh-Tale, and Impel Down. The posters are printed on matte paper, hand cut by the artist himself. Each of these posters can be purchased individually, or you can get all 4 of them together for 50% off. You can also still get the premium package if you want to appear on my streams, and in that case you can also choose any poster from 2024 as well. So if you want God Valley, Marijua, Laugh-Tale, and Impel Down for your walls, just hit the link in the description below. All posters from 2024 will also be available in the complete original set bundle. So that aside, the single biggest misconception regarding Nika is that what we are seeing with Luffy is the true Nika. That is explicitly explained to us to not be the case. We have no idea whether or not a real Nika even exists. What Luffy's fruit represents is simply what people imagine Nika to be. Devil fruits are born from people's imaginations, not reality. So it's irrelevant if this is what Nika is actually like. Hell, we are told straight up that it's not even relevant if a real Nika even exists or not, as the devil fruit is totally separate from that. All that matters is that a lot of people imagine this vision of Nika, and so therefore this vision of Nika becomes a devil fruit. And so based on this explanation of devil fruits, if a real Nika even exists, then he could be something totally different from any of the giants' beliefs. The real Nika could be some satanic demon for all we know. The real Nika could be a giant purple elephant. None of that has any relevance whatsoever to Luffy's fruit, because Luffy's fruit is just what people imagine Nika to be. Except now in Elbaf we've learned that this is just one common vision of what people imagine Nika to be. A substantial number of giants also imagine Nika to actually be a very different warrior of destruction. And so by the same virtue of the laughing, liberating version of Nika manifesting as Luffy's fruit, by the established laws of the One Piece world, a destroyer version of Nika should also manifest as another fruit. Now from the beginning of Elbaf there were a lot of clues that Loki legitimately has another Nika fruit. From his very introduction he tells us that he is the sun god, which seemed like a laughable claim at the time, as we knew that Luffy has the sun god fruit. But at the same time, all throughout Elbaf, Oda has been slowly building up the idea further and further that the sun god concept actually has a lot of variations, and a major giveaway may have been the fact that Loki is not claiming to be the same type of Nika that Luffy is. Loki is claiming to be the destroyer version of Nika that many other giants believe in. And what's interesting is that Oda has almost been blatantly teasing the fact that Loki may very well be a dark version of Luffy's Nika fruit, as Luffy's Nika form was introduced to us with the iconic pose of Luffy all in white, holding his head and his sides as he wildly laughed. And Oda very deliberately drew Loki in the exact same pose in the Giants' retelling of Loki's deeds. Only in this, Loki is depicted all in black. Even considering the fact that Oda tends to use silhouettes in short backstories, Loki's drawing here is particularly unique as Oda uses a completely black cartoonish figure for him, which is very different from Oda's usual silhouettes. If anything, this drawing seems like a very deliberate choice to recreate Luffy's classic white Nika imagery with a stark contrast, all black version with Loki. suggesting that this is some very on-the-nose foreshadowing for Loki legitimately eventually being the wielder of the dark version of the Nika fruit. It would especially make sense that this dark Nika would represent the destructive version of Nika that many giants imagine, as the children of Elbaf were instructed to draw their fears. And logically, the laughing liberation version of Nika that Luffy represents would never inspire any fear. This white form should bring joy and lift people's spirits. So why then does Nika feature among the children's fears? Naturally, because there are many Elbaf giants who believe in a destructive version of Nika, one who would destroy the world itself. This concept of Nika that many believe in would naturally inspire great fear among the children, and so now we have two pieces of visual foreshadowing suggesting the idea of this dark version of Nika. On top of this, we know that the fruit that Loki ate is one that is extremely important to the Elbaf people and their culture, as it was passed down through the royal family line for generations. Considering the giant's entire culture seems to so fervently revere Nika, the only fruit that really makes sense as being both extremely precious to the culture of Elbaf and that would also make Loki believe that he is now the sun god would naturally be the sun god Nika fruit itself. Not Luffy's version, but the version that Elbaf passed down in its royal line. This is especially likely considering that Harold, the previous user of the Elbaf royal family fruit, also supposedly attempted to be Nika. I wouldn't be surprised if Harold couldn't awaken the Nika fruit, whereas Loki, as the true perfect match for the fruit, was able to awaken it, and now believes that he is the sun god. It's also particularly interesting that Loki ate his infamous fruit that he believes made him the sun god 14 years ago, while Luffy ate his Nika fruit 13 years ago. There is a clear parallel storyline developing between Loki and Luffy, and what's most interesting about Loki's storyline is the emphasis on the fact that he is an infamous prankster. See, a lot of people have suggested that Loki's fruit is some all-powerful, destructive Zoan that would make him believe he's the sun god, such as the Surtur fruit. But that doesn't make sense, as Loki grew up steeped in the lore of Elbaf. He knows what he's talking about when he's referencing the sun god. The sun god to Loki means Nika specifically, and so if Loki believes that the fruit that he has eaten is the Nika fruit, then he would only consider himself to be the sun god if he'd specifically gotten Nika's abilities, and then consider that the one commonality of every single version of Nika that the giants imagine is that whether he's a savior, a liberator, a ruler, or a destroyer, Nika is always defined by laughter. We know that Oda matches the fruit to the user, and especially Zoan fruits tend to match the personality of the user. If Loki's fruit is truly just some generic fire god fruit like Surtur, then why is Oda building up Loki's personality so much as being defined as a prankster? That is the one core trait of Loki's persona. Yes, he's a wildly destructive individual, but he does it all gleefully and with laughter. He's historically causing so much destruction while playing jokes. Doesn't this sound exactly like the version of Nika that would be a destroyer rather than a liberator? At the end of the day, the constant is that Nika is always tied to laughter, it's just what comes with that laughter that tends to change. So we have to ask, if Oda is writing this character who is written not just as a destroyer, but also specifically as this laughing, joking prankster, why would Oda make the merging of these two character types what defines Loki? Unless Oda is building up Loki to be an alternative, dark version of Nika. We've had destructive warrior figures before, but Loki is very specifically not just this violent berserker. He's written with this comedic angle precisely because his fruit will fit that as well. Remember, the concept of the character Loki would likely have come in reverse, based on the needs of the story. If Oda needed to introduce a wielder of the dark version of the Nika fruit, then Oda would have needed to invent a character who represents both the destructive tendencies of this version of Nika, while still embodying the essence of a laughing warrior. And so Oda created Loki as the one fitting to introduce this fruit. And where it gets really interesting is when you think about the concept of the Nika fruit in the first place. Everyone understands that Luffy's cartoonish abilities were obviously inspired by, well, cartoons. However, to be more precise, the initial concept of taking Toon Force out of cartoons and actually using it as a reality warping tool of combat was first introduced in the film The Mask. While One Piece itself is a manga, it does not have full-on cartoon universe logic. Not until Luffy uses Gear 5th and then begins to warp reality and introduce Toon Force to it, exactly like the film The Mask. Considering Oda loves films, and One Piece is littered with popular film references, and the fact that The Mask was a very popular film that predates One Piece, it's very likely that Oda took some inspiration from The Mask when thinking about how his own protagonist would eventually fight. The idea of a hero who's the only one who can use Toon Force to defeat his enemies in comedic fashion. And when Gear 5th was first introduced, one of the most common things that readers would point out is that this is just like The Mask. Now the kicker is that The Mask notably had a sequel, And in that sequel, we learn that the mask's powers originated from the Norse god Loki. If Oda was in some way inspired by the original Mask story, which is extremely likely considering it's a very unique concept and was the first widely popular depiction of the idea of a hero using Toon Force outside of cartoons, then I would not be surprised if in Oda's plans to have a second wielder of a Nika fruit, he paid homage to the Mask story again, with it being wielded by Loki, just as in the film's sequel. Loki is traditionally, after all, the god of trickery. And finally, and most importantly, consider how all this fits together for Luffy's story, as ultimately the main character story is what matters the most. One of the clear developing themes of Elbaf has been Luffy learning about and accepting his broader role in the world, and particularly what it means to be Nika. This entire arc, from the moment that we set foot in Elbaf, it's been a non-stop discussion around the concept of Nika. This is what Nika's supposed to be like, no, this is what Nika's supposed to be like. It's just a never-ending debate around this figure. And naturally, at the center of this discussion is Luffy. Everyone knows Luffy takes the form of this warrior, and everyone is interested in seeing it. Even Skopper Gaban knows how important this is. And yet Luffy rejects the importance of it all, or even the notion that this has anything to do with him. Like it or not, Luffy has an extremely important role to play in the world, a role that has been thrust upon him. And with so many interpretations of what this role is supposed to look like, one of the key developing ideas of the arc seems to be Luffy coming to terms with being Nika and representing a good path of what Nika ideally should be like. The perfect way to have this thematic conflict play out is by paralleling Luffy against a dark version of Nika, one who represents the wrong path that the world will go down. I do believe that this will eventually lead to Luffy facing off against Blackbeard, who will ultimately wield the dark version of the Nika fruit, an idea I expanded upon in great detail in this video that you can watch after this one. But at least in the context of the Elbaf arc, I believe the juxtaposition is set up to be very important, of the type of Nika that Loki and his fruit represents versus the type of Nika that Luffy and his fruit represents. It's also interesting to note that one of Loki's primary abilities, the lightning from his hammer, has no effect on Luffy. So when it comes to any sort of potential matchup between Luffy and Loki, it would truly just be a display of Nika abilities up against other Nika abilities, a choice that was surely intentional by Oda. And finally, while the idea of another Nika fruit may be too jarring to embrace despite all the evidence, that may very well be the point. He is confident that he is the sun god. That confidence has to stem from somewhere. Oda has set the stage that any fruit can manifest as long as enough people imagine it. Oda has established that many people imagine Nika completely differently, and most importantly, Oda has crafted Loki's entire character to perfectly fit with the fearsome concept of Nika. As Loki is a warrior who embodies both laughter and destruction. Loki is the character who seems almost perfectly crafted to represent an opposite version of Nika to Luffy, and he may make for the perfect symbolic conflict for Elbaf. So let me know what you believe Loki's fruit is in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe. And you can get my extended thoughts on whether or not Loki is now set up to be the primary antagonist of Elbaf in my weekly podcast that just dropped, by becoming a member or by supporting me on Patreon, link in the description below.